My name is Sylvia Colbert, and I'm 30 years old. For about 5 years, my older brother Brett drove a car that was registered in my name, and for about 5 years, he racked up tickets and tolls on that car, speeding tickets, parking tickets, unpaid tolls, late fees stacked on late fees, until the total came to $6,400. All of it under my name, all of it on my record. Because the car was mine on paper, even though I almost never drove it and he drove it every single day. I found out how bad it had gotten the day I got a letter saying my driver's license was suspended. Mine. For unpaid violations I didn't commit on a car I didn't drive, accumulated by a brother who shrugged when I confronted him and said, and I will never forget the exact words, "You barely drive anyway, so what's your problem?" What's my problem? My license was suspended. My name was attached to $6,400 of someone else's recklessness. And my brother's response was to act like I was being unreasonable for minding. I went to my parents thinking surely they'd see it. And my parents, my mother and my father, the people who made me, told me to just pay it. Quietly. Don't make a thing of it, Sylvia. He's your brother. Just pay it off and we'll all move on. Don't blow up the family over money. Pay it. Quietly. $6,400 of my brother's tickets, with my own suspended license, and the family solution was for me to absorb it silently so that Brett would never have to feel a single consequence. I said, "Fine." And then I reached into my bag and I pulled out a folder. A folder I'd been quietly building for months. And I set it on the table and I turned it so my brother could see what was on top. And when Brett saw what was on top of that folder, his smile died. Because it wasn't a receipt. It wasn't me agreeing to pay. It was something he never ever expected the overlooked little sister to have. And it meant that pay it quietly was no longer one of the options on the table for anyone. Before I go any further, if you've ever been the family member expected to absorb the cost of someone else's behavior just to keep the peace, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need it, and drop your city and the time where you're listening from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel at night. I'm Sylvia. This is the story of a brother who treated my name like his property, the parents who told me to swallow it, and the folder I built that finally made the truth too solid to ignore. Before I start, I want to say something to anyone listening who has ever been the responsible one in a family, the one whose reliability somehow became everyone else's safety net, the one expected to absorb what the favored ones spill. I know the trap of it. I know how being good and careful and dependable can quietly turn you into a resource instead of a person. And I know how hard it is to stop, because stopping feels like betraying the only role that ever earned you a place. But I learned something this winter that I'd give a lot to have known sooner. You cannot be loved for being useful. You can only be used for it. And the day you stop being useful is the day you find out whether there was ever any love underneath. It's a frightening thing to test, but not knowing is its own kind of prison. To understand the folder, you have to understand how I ended up being the kind of person who'd put her name on her brother's car in the first place. And that goes all the way back to before I was born. I was not supposed to exist. I don't say that for drama. I say it because it's the literal, stated fact of my childhood, repeated often enough that I absorbed it into my bones before I was old enough to understand what it meant. My brother Brett was planned. Brett was wanted. Brett arrived when my parents were ready, financially and otherwise, and he was welcomed like the sun coming up. I came 4 years later, at the worst possible time. A layoff, a hard stretch, money so tight that another baby was, in my parents' own words, the last thing we needed. I was the accident, the surprise, the mouth they hadn't budgeted for. My parents would tell this story at dinner tables, to relatives, sometimes to me directly, in a tone that was supposed to be fond. We didn't plan on Sylvia, she just showed up, and we had to figure it out. Everyone would laugh. And I'd laugh too, because that's what you do, but every time, a little more of it sank in. Brett was wanted, and you were a problem to be figured out. Brett was the plan, and you were what went wrong with it. I learned to read the difference everywhere. In 1,000 small ways, a child registers before she has words for them. Brett's baby book was full. Mine was half empty, started late, abandoned early, as if by the second child the novelty of documenting a life had worn off, or as if my life had felt less worth documenting. Brett's childhood drawings got framed. Mine went in a drawer. When money was tight, and money was often tight, it was understood without anyone saying it that Brett's needs came first, because Brett's needs were real needs, and mine were extras, the way an unplanned person's needs are always somehow extra. I got the hand-me-downs, the smaller room, the "we'll see" that meant no. None of it was framed as cruelty. It was just the natural math of a family where one child had been wanted, and one had arrived as a complication, and complications learn early to ask for less. That distinction shaped everything. Brett grew up knowing, in the deep, secure way that planned and wanted children know, that his place in the family was unconditional. He could fail, misbehave, take, and the love didn't waver, because his belonging had never been in question. I grew up knowing the opposite, that my place was provisional, that I was the one who'd arrived uninvited, and that I had to earn my spot at a table I hadn't been expected to sit at. So I became useful, I became easy. I became the one who never caused problems, who helped, who gave, who said yes, because somewhere underneath it all, I believed that if I were accommodating enough, agreeable enough, useful enough, I might finally be wanted the way my brother was simply for existing. I have spent a lot of my adult life understanding what that did to me, and I'll save you the long version. It made me a person who could not tell the difference between being loved and being needed. Because in my family, the closest I ever got to feeling loved was the warm flush of being useful, of solving a problem, of saying the yes that made everyone relieved, of being told, "Thank goodness for Sylvia." That feeling, the only version of belonging I'd ever been offered, was indistinguishable to me from love. And a person who confuses being needed with being loved will give and give and give, will say yes to things she should refuse, will sign her name to things she shouldn't, chasing a feeling that the giving never quite delivers. Because being needed is not the same as being loved, and no amount of the first ever adds up to the second. You can probably already see how a person built like that ends up putting her name on her brother's car. Brett was, and is, the kind of person the world hands things to and then forgives. He was charming. He was the favorite, and favorites develop a particular relationship with consequences. Namely, that consequences are for other people. Whatever Brett broke, someone else swept up. Whatever Brett needed, the family provided. Whatever Brett did wrong, there was a reason, an excuse, a soft landing. He moved through life with the easy confidence of a person who has never once had to fully absorb the cost of his own choices, because there had always been a parent or a sister positioned to absorb it for him. And I want to be honest that for a long time, I didn't resent him for it. That's the strange thing about growing up as the unplanned one next to the favorite. You don't necessarily hate the favorite. Often you love them, and you help them, and you participate in their specialness, because being useful to the golden child is one of the few ways the overlooked child gets to feel close to the warmth. I loved Brett. I wanted Brett to like me, to need me, to be glad I was around. Helping him was a way of buying a little belonging. So when the family needed someone to do something for Brett, I was always the natural volunteer because I'd spent my whole life auditioning for a spot that the favorite had been given for free. Which brings us to the car. About 5 years ago, Brett needed a car and couldn't get one in his own name. His credit was a mess. Brett's finances were always a mess, in the way that the finances of people who never face consequences tend to be. He'd had things repossessed, accounts sent to collections, the works. No lender was going to put a car in Brett's name on reasonable terms. And so my parents came to me, and they framed it the way they framed everything they wanted me to do for Brett, as a small, loving favor that a good family member would obviously say yes to. I remember the exact conversation because it happened in my parents' kitchen, and because every person in the room played the role they'd played my whole life. My mother did the warm, persuasive part. My father did the reasonable, it's no big deal part. Brett sat there looking wounded and hopeful, the wronged favorite who just needed a little help getting back on his feet. And I did my part too, which was to feel the familiar pull of being asked, being needed, being the one who could fix it. There's a specific feeling when your family turns to you and says, "You're the only one who can help with this." And for a person who grew up unsure of her place, that feeling is intoxicating. For one moment, the unplanned child is essential. For one moment, you're not the complication, you're the solution. I would have signed almost anything to keep feeling that for a few more minutes. Just put the car in your name, honey. Your credit's good, you're so responsible, it's just on paper. Brett will make all the payments, he'll handle everything. It's just a formality to help your brother get back on his feet. That's what family does. That's what family does. I'd been hearing that sentence my whole life, and it had always meant the same thing. That's what you do, Sylvia, for the people who actually matter. It was never said to Brett. Nobody ever told Brett that family means putting your name on the line for your sister because the favors in my family only ran one direction, from the provisional child to the planned one, from the one earning her place to the one who'd always had his. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Saying yes was the only language I'd ever been taught for earning my place. And there was a part of me, I can admit this now, that felt proud. Look at me, the responsible one, the one with good credit, the one who could finally do something Brett couldn't. For once, my carefulness, my unglamorous reliability, was worth something to this family. I signed the papers, feeling almost honored. That's the cruelest part, looking back. They handed me the instrument of years of my own exploitation, and I took it like a gift, because being useful was the closest thing to being loved that I knew. And if you've ever said yes to something you knew, somewhere deep down, you'd regret, just because saying no felt like risking your place in the family, tell me in the comments. I think a lot of us have signed our names to things out of a hunger just to belong. For the first while, it was fine. Or it looked fine, which in my family was the same thing. Brett had his car. He made the payments mostly more or less on time, and I didn't think much about it. The registration was in my name, the insurance was a tangle we'd sorted out, and I drove my own little car and rarely, if ever, touched his. Months went by. I told myself I'd done a good thing, helped my brother, been the kind of family member who shows up. For a little while, the yes felt like it had bought me something. But here's what I didn't understand about putting your name on something a careless person uses. Your name becomes the address where all their consequences get delivered. And Brett was careless in the specific way of a person who has never paid for his carelessness. He drove fast. He didn't pay tolls, it just blew through them, figuring he'd deal with it later. Except later never came. He parked wherever he wanted. He let tickets pile up on the dashboard and then in the glove box. And then, I assume, in the trash. And every single one of those violations was registered to the car, and the car was registered to me. And so every single one of them became, legally, mine. This is the part that's worth slowing down on, because I think a lot of people don't realize how this works until it happens to them. When a car is registered in your name, you are the responsible party for what that car does in the eyes of the system. A toll runs unpaid. The bill goes to the registered owner. A parking ticket? The registered owner. A camera catches the car speeding. The notice, the fine, the eventual penalty. All of it attaches to the name on the registration, not to whoever's hands were on the wheel. The system doesn't know or care that Brett was driving. The system only knows the car is Sylvia's. So every reckless thing my brother did became a debit against my name, accumulating in an account I didn't even know was open. I didn't even know how bad it was getting at first, because the notices went to the address on the registration, which had at some point gotten tangled up so that some went to him and some to our parents, and the system was a mess. Brett intercepted what he could and ignored the rest. The tolls compounded. The tickets gained late fees. The late fees gained penalties. $6,400 doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way all slow disasters happen. A little at a time, while the person whose name is on it has no idea the water is rising. Each individual violation was small, a $40 toll, a $60 ticket, but Brett generated them constantly and ignored them completely, and small things ignored completely have a way of breeding in the dark. By the time I learned the number, it had grown into something that looked less like carelessness and more like a debt someone had run up on a stolen card. Except the card wasn't stolen. I'd handed it to him with a bow, calling it family, until the day I got the letter. My license suspended because of unpaid violations I had no idea existed, on a car I almost never drove. I want you to understand what a suspended license meant for me, specifically because it's the thing that turned this from a family annoyance into something I could not let go. I'm an accountant. My life runs on being responsible, on being trustworthy, on my name being clean. That's not just my personality, it's my profession. A suspended license is a problem for anyone, but for someone whose entire career is built on financial reliability, having $6,400 in unpaid violations attached to your name, having the state revoke your ability to drive because you're delinquent, that's not an inconvenience. That touches my livelihood. It touches the one thing I'd spent my whole life building, a reputation as the responsible one, the trustworthy one, the one who handles things correctly. Brett's carelessness had reached out and put a stain on the exact thing I'd used to earn my place in the world. There's a bitter irony in it I sat with for a long time. The one quality that had ever made me valuable to my family, my reliability, my clean record, my good standing, was now being eroded by the very act of being valuable to them. I'd lent my good name to Brett because it was good, and the lending of it was destroying its goodness. The more useful I was, the more damaged I became. That's the trap of being the responsible one in an irresponsible family. The thing they prize you for is the thing they slowly consume. They don't even mean to destroy it. They just keep drawing on it the way you draw on any resource you assume is infinite, until one day you look up and the account is overdrawn, and the responsible one's name, the only thing she ever really had, is in the red. And I couldn't even drive to work. So I went to Brett, and this is the conversation that changed everything. Because it's the moment I understood, finally, fully, what I actually was to my brother. I showed him the suspension letter. I explained, trying to stay calm, that his tickets had suspended my license, that I needed him to deal with this, to pay these off, to fix it. I remember I was almost apologetic about it. That's how deep the training ran. I was the one whose license had been suspended, the victim of the situation, and I was approaching my brother gently, carefully, the way you'd approach asking a favor. Because even in being wronged, I couldn't shake the habit of making myself small around Brett. And Brett, my charming, favored, never once inconvenienced brother, looked at the letter and looked at me and gave a little laugh and said, "You barely drive anyway, so what's your problem? It's not like the suspension even affects you. Relax. I'll get to it. You barely drive anyway. So what's your problem?" In that one sentence, Brett told me everything. He genuinely did not see my name, my license, my record, my career as mine, as things that belonged to me and mattered. He saw them as resources that existed for his convenience. My good credit was something he was entitled to use. My clean record was acceptable collateral damage. My suspended license didn't count as a real problem because I didn't count as a real person with a real life that could be damaged. I was the unplanned one, the useful one, the one whose entire function was to absorb. Of course, my license suspension wasn't a problem. I wasn't a problem worth solving. I was just the surface his consequences happened to land on. And I'll get to it. He said that the way he'd said it, his whole life, the way a person says it, when they have never once had to actually get to anything, because someone always got to it for them. He wasn't going to get to it. We both knew he wasn't going to get to it. I'll get to it was just the noise he made to end conversations about his responsibilities. A sound that had always worked because the family was structured to make sure his not getting to it never cost him anything. It would cost me. It was already costing me. And he told me to relax. That was the moment something in me went very quiet and very clear. I did not yell at Brett. I want you to notice that because it matters. The old Sylvia, the one who'd spent 30 years auditioning for belonging, might have cried, might have begged him to understand, might have made an emotional appeal to his love for me. But standing there holding that suspension letter while my brother told me to relax, I understood for the first time that there was no emotional appeal to make. You cannot appeal to someone's love for you when they don't experience you as a person whose problems are real. Begging Brett to care was like begging the road to care about the tire. I wasn't a sister to him. I was infrastructure. So I didn't beg. I went home. And I did the thing I'm actually good at, the thing my whole profession is built on. I started building a record. Because here's what being an accountant teaches you. Feelings don't win arguments. Stories don't win arguments. Documentation wins arguments. You don't argue about whether the numbers are right. You produce the ledger, and the ledger ends the conversation. I had spent my whole life losing the family argument because it was always my feelings against Brett's specialness. And specialness wins every emotional contest in a family like mine. But specialness does not beat a folder. Specialness does not beat a toll camera photograph with a date and a time. Specialness does not beat a notarized document. I had been trying to win in the wrong arena my entire life. So I changed arenas. I started building the folder, and I want to tell you what that process did to me emotionally because it was the most important part. More important than the legal outcome. Every evening after work, I'd sit at my kitchen table and add to it, pull another record, match another date, file another photograph. And page by page, something shifted in me. For 30 years, I'd carried a low, constant doubt about myself. The unplanned one's doubt, the quiet suspicion that maybe I really was less. Maybe my problems really were smaller. Maybe I really was the one who should always give way. But you cannot build a meticulous case for your own innocence without slowly coming to believe in it. Each document was a small sentence in an argument I was making to myself as much as to anyone. You were not there. This was not your doing. Your name was used. You are not the problem. By the time the folder was thick, I'd convinced the most important juror there was. I'd convinced me. I want to walk you through what I gathered, because the building of it was the thing that slowly gave me back my sense of myself, page by page. First, I pulled the complete record of every violation, every ticket, every toll, every fee, with its exact date, time, and location. Months of work, requesting records, organizing them into a timeline. $6,400, itemized, dated, sorted. Then I did the thing that being the person who barely drives made possible. For each violation, I documented where I was at that date and time, and because I'm a creature of routine with a paper trail a mile long, work badge logs, card transactions, calendar entries, the digital breadcrumbs of a responsible person's life, I could prove violation by violation that I was somewhere else, at my office, at my desk, across town, nowhere near the car when the car was speeding through a toll plaza 40 miles away. My brother's taunt, "You barely drive," turned out to be the keystone of my entire case. Because I barely drove, I had an airtight alibi for nearly every single violation. He'd mocked me with the exact fact that would sink him. Then, the toll cameras. Toll violations come with photographs. Many of them capture the driver. I requested the images, and there, in photo after photo, time-stamped, was Brett. Brett's face behind the wheel of the car registered to me on the exact dates the violations occurred. Not me. Him. Documented by the state's own cameras. I remember the first one coming through, opening the file, and seeing my brother's face behind the wheel on a date. My badge log put me 3 counties away at my desk. I sat with that image for a long time. Proof, actual, photographic, time-stamped proof that the thing I'd been told to handle quietly had never been mine at all. And then I gathered the messages. Texts where Brett casually admitted the driving was his. "Yeah, I got flashed by a toll camera again, LOL. Don't worry about the parking thing, I'll handle it." His own words, acknowledging that the violations were his doing, sitting in my phone, dated and saved. I had, in other words, built an absolutely complete, absolutely undeniable record that every dollar of that $6,400 belonged to my brother's driving, not mine. And then I took it one step further, the step that turned the folder from a complaint into a conclusion. I went and made it official. This is the part that's important, and I'll keep it simple because the law here is actually straightforward. When a vehicle is registered in your name, but someone else is the one committing the violations, there are legal mechanisms to transfer that responsibility to the actual driver, to formally establish with evidence that you were not the operator and that the liability belongs to the person who was. It's not a dramatic courtroom thing. It's paperwork. It's an affidavit, a sworn, notarized statement of fact, supported by evidence, filed with the relevant authorities, that says, "I was not driving. Here is proof of who was. Transfer the responsibility accordingly." So I prepared it. I wrote out the sworn statement. I attached the timeline, the alibi documentation, the toll camera photographs of Brett, the messages. I had it notarized, made official, legally weighted, no longer just my word, but a sworn document backed by evidence. And I began the formal process, the affidavit to contest and transfer the violations, the application to restore my license once the responsibility was correctly assigned, and the paperwork to transfer the car itself fully into Brett's name so that going forward, his consequences would land where they belonged, on him. And I put all of it in a folder. And on the very top, the first thing anyone opening that folder would see, I placed the notarized affidavit, stamped and official, with the filing confirmation. Underneath it, the toll camera photo of Brett's face behind the wheel. Underneath that, everything else. I built that folder over months, quietly, telling no one. Not my parents, not Brett. I just kept showing up to the family the same accommodating Sylvia I'd always been, while in the evenings I assembled, page by notarized page, the end of my career as the family's shock absorber. And then my parents called the family meeting about the money, and I brought the folder. The meeting was at my parents' house on a cold January evening, and it was an ambush dressed up as a conversation. The framing, when I walked in, was already set. This was about Sylvia's issue with the car, and the family was gathering to resolve it, which meant getting Sylvia to be reasonable. Brett was there, relaxed, sprawled on the couch with the easy posture of a man who has never once worried that a family meeting might go badly for him. My mother had her concerned face on. My father had his let's be practical face on. And the conclusion had clearly been reached before I arrived. Sylvia would pay the $6,400 quietly, and the family would move on, and Brett would never feel a thing. My father started. He said they'd all been talking, and that while it was unfortunate about my license, the important thing was to take care of it without drama. My mother jumped in. "It's just money, sweetheart. Family is more important than money. If you make a big legal fuss about this, you could really hurt your brother. It could affect his record, his job, everything. Do you really want to do that to Brett? Just pay it off quietly. You're the responsible one. You can handle it." There it was. The whole architecture of my life in 3 sentences. You're the responsible one, meaning you're the one who absorbs. Do you really want to hurt your brother, meaning Brett's well-being is the real priority and yours is negotiable. It's just money. Easy to say when it's not your money, not your license, not your name. They were asking me to pay $6,400 and need a license suspension to protect the feelings and the record of the brother who'd caused all of it. And they were framing my reluctance to do so as me being the one who might hurt the family. I want to point out the most twisted part of that framing, because it took me 30 years to see it clearly, and now I can't unsee it. In my mother's sentence, hurting Brett, making him face the consequences of his own actions, was described as something I would be doing to him, as if the $6,400 were a weapon I was choosing to fire at my brother, rather than a debt he had created and was trying to make me pay. The favored child's consequences are always framed, in a family like mine, as aggressions committed by whoever stops absorbing them. Brett running up the debt was just Brett being Brett. Me declining to pay it was me doing this to him. The golden child never acts. He is only ever acted upon. Everything bad that happens to him is someone else's cruelty, never his own arithmetic coming due. And Brett, from the couch, delivered the line that, in retrospect, I'm almost grateful for, because it removed my last hesitation. He said with that little laugh, "Yeah, Sil, don't be dramatic. It's not a big deal. You barely even drive." You barely even drive. Again, the same words. He had no idea, none of them had any idea that he'd just repeated for the second time the exact phrase that I had spent months turning into the foundation of his undoing. I looked at the three of them, and I said very calmly, "Okay, fine." And I watched the relief wash over the room. There it is, Sylvia folding, Sylvia absorbing, like always. My mother actually smiled. My father's shoulders came down. Brett went back to his phone. The machine had worked, the way it always worked. Present the unplanned daughter with the favored son's mess. Invoke family. Invoke drama. And watch her fold. 30 years of conditioning executing perfectly. One last time. And then I reached into my bag and I took out the folder and I set it on the coffee table and I turned it to face my brother. "Before I handle it," I said, "I want everyone to see what handling it actually looks like. Brett, why don't you open the folder?" He didn't move at first. He just looked at it, then at me. The easy smile still on his face, but a flicker of uncertainty behind it because this was not in the script. The script was Sylvia folding. The script did not include a folder, so I opened it for him, and I turned the top page toward him so he could read it. The notarized affidavit, stamped, official, a sworn legal document filed, establishing that I was not the driver responsible for the violations, and formally transferring that responsibility to the actual operator of the vehicle. Supported, it said, by photographic and documentary evidence attached, and underneath, sticking out just enough to see, the toll camera photograph, Brett's face, behind the wheel, time stamped on the date of one of the violations. I watched my brother's eyes move across that affidavit, watched him take in the notary stamp, the filing confirmation, the words transfer of liability, and I watched his smile die completely. It just slid off his face because Brett, for all his carelessness, was not stupid, and he understood in about 4 seconds what he was looking at. He was looking at proof. He was looking at official, filed, notarized, photograph-backed proof that the $6,400 was his, legally, demonstrably, and that I had already begun the process of making it his on paper, the way it had always been his in fact. I had imagined that moment many times while building the folder, and the reality was both exactly like and nothing like what I'd pictured. I'd expected to feel triumphant. Instead, what I felt watching the smile leave my brother's face was something quieter and stranger, a kind of grief almost, for the relationship we were never going to have now, mixed with a relief so deep it was almost physical. For 30 years, Brett's smile had been the family's weather. When Brett was pleased, the family was at peace, and keeping Brett pleased had been everyone's job, mine most of all. And here I was, watching that smile die, and the sky did not fall. The world did not end. I had done the unthinkable thing. I had displeased the favorite, and I was still standing, still breathing, still myself. Maybe more myself than I'd ever been. "What?" he said. "What is this, Sil? What did you do?" "I documented it," I said. "All of it. every violation with the date and time and proof of where I was each time. Which is easy, Brett, because you're right, I barely drive. And the toll cameras took your picture. The state has photos of you driving my car every time you broke the law in it. And I've sworn all of it out and notarized it and filed it. So the $6,400 isn't mine to pay quietly. It's yours. It always was. I just made it official. If you've ever finally stood up to a family that counted on you staying quiet, tell me below what gave you the courage. I think the moment you stop absorbing other people's consequences is one of the most terrifying and freeing things a person can do. The room did not stay calm. My father grabbed the folder and started going through it, and I watched his face change as he turned the pages, because the pages were undeniable. This wasn't Sylvia being emotional. This wasn't Sylvia's feelings against Brett's specialness. This was a notarized legal document and a stack of state toll camera photographs and a timeline an accountant had built. There was nothing to argue with. You cannot tell a notary stamp it's being dramatic. You cannot tell a toll camera it's overreacting. My mother started in immediately on the emotional track because that was the family's only weapon and she didn't have another. Sylvia, how could you, filing legal papers against your own brother, going behind our backs for months? This is so cold. This is so calculated. This isn't like you. And she was right that it wasn't like me. It wasn't like the Sylvia they'd built, the one who absorbs. It was like the new Sylvia, the one who'd finally stopped. It's exactly like me, Mom, I said. I'm an accountant. I keep records. You just never needed me to keep one about this family before. And then my father, still holding the folder, went very pale because he'd reached the part of it I hadn't even mentioned yet. The part that was the second blade. Because while I'd been building the folder, I'd also found the messages, the ones between my parents and Brett, the ones that proved they'd known for a long time how bad the tickets were getting, known the violations were piling up under my name, and had quietly decided, among the three of them, to keep it from me and let it ride because, as one message from my mother to Brett put it, Sylvia doesn't really pay attention to that stuff. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out if it ever comes up. We'll figure it out if it ever comes up. Their plan, in writing, had always been for me to absorb it. They hadn't been blindsided by Brett's tickets. They'd been managing me, keeping me in the dark, planning to spring, just pay it quietly on me whenever the bill finally landed. The family meeting wasn't them discovering a problem. It was the execution of a plan they'd had for years. I had found those messages weeks earlier, and they had been, in their own way, more painful than anything Brett did. Because Brett's cruelty I could almost understand. He was careless, entitled, raised to never feel a consequence. He wasn't really thinking about me at all. But my parents' messages were different. My parents had thought about me, had specifically considered me, my obliviousness, my reliability, and had made a calculated decision to use those qualities against me. Sylvia doesn't pay attention. We'll figure it out, Imu, meaning she'll pay it. They'd sat down in effect and planned how to spend their daughter. That wasn't carelessness, that was strategy. and it confirmed the thing I'd feared my whole life and never let myself fully believe, that to them, I really was a resource first and a daughter second. The unplanned child, finally serving the purpose her existence had apparently always been for. I included those messages in the folder near the bottom because I wanted my father to find them himself. I wanted him to turn the pages and reach his own wife's handwriting and understand, without me saying a word, that the folder wasn't only about Brett. It was about all three of them. And I watched him reach it. And I watched his face. And I knew he'd understood. My father looked up from that message, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my father be unable to look at me, because the folder didn't just expose Brett. It exposed all three of them. It exposed that this hadn't been carelessness the family was now nobly trying to resolve. It had been a quiet, years-long arrangement in which the unplanned daughter would be kept uninformed and then leaned on to absorb the planned son's mess. The thing they'd done to me wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. And now the strategy was sitting on the coffee table in my mother's handwriting, next to a notary stamp. "Sylvia," my father started, and his practical voice was gone, replaced by something smaller. It wasn't like that. You were going to figure it out if it ever came up," I said. "It came up. You figured it'd be me. It's not going to be me." And here's the thing they all understood slowly as the evening went on that made it different from every other family confrontation I'd ever lost. There was nothing they could do. In the past, my parents could always fix things for Brett, smooth it over, make a problem disappear with a phone call or a check or their sheer insistence that everyone move on. But I hadn't given them something to negotiate. I'd given them something already done. The affidavit was filed. The evidence was submitted. The process was in motion. They couldn't talk me out of it because it wasn't a threat I was making. It was an action I'd already taken. For the first time, the family's power to protect Brett ran into something it could not move. A legal record, sworn and filed, that didn't care who was the favorite. They wanted to save him. I watched them want it frantically, my mother's mind visibly racing for the angle, the appeal, the guilt that would make me undo it. But there was no undo. That was the whole point of doing it the way I did. I hadn't come to ask permission to stop being the shock absorber. I'd come to inform them that I already had. The fallout was exactly what you'd expect and also, in its way, clarifying. Brett raged. Once the charm stopped working, and it stopped working the instant the folder hit the table, what was underneath it turned out to be ugly. He called me a traitor, a snake, said I'd ambushed the family, said I was destroying his life over a few tickets. $6,400 of his tickets on my suspended license was a few tickets, and my objecting to it was destroying his life. The math of the favored child never does add up, but it adds up even less when you finally put it on paper. What struck me most in his raging was that not once, not a single time through all of it, did Brett say he was sorry. Not sorry for the suspension, not sorry for the years of tickets, not sorry for, "You barely drive, what's your problem?" His entire emotional response was about what was being done to him by my refusal to keep absorbing. The possibility that he had wronged me never entered his mind, because in the world Brett had been raised in, my function was to absorb, and his function was to be absorbed for. And a sister enforcing a boundary wasn't a wronged party finally standing up. She was a malfunctioning appliance. You don't apologize to an appliance. You bang on it and demand to know why it stopped working. That's what Brett's rage was. A man banging on a machine that had finally, after 30 years, refused to run. And Brett did face real consequences, the legal kind, the kind he'd been insulated from his entire life. The violations became his, formally. The financial responsibility landed where it belonged, on him, with his messy finances, with no responsible sister to absorb it this time. The car was transferred fully into his name, which meant he now owned outright both the vehicle and every future consequence of how he drove it. And because the affidavit established the pattern of violations as his, he was dealing with the state directly, on his own record, for the first time. It wasn't prison, it wasn't a courtroom drama, it was just finally the bill arriving at the correct address. But for a man who had never once paid his own bill, that was catastrophic. He'd built a whole life on the assumption that someone else's name would always be there to catch what he dropped. And the name was gone. I want to be honest about how much it cost him because the bill arrived at the correct address undersells it. $6,400. Now his, with his finances already in collections. That's a crisis for someone like Brett. His own license came into jeopardy over the unpaid violations once they were his. The car he'd treated as casually as a rental was now fully his responsibility. Insurance and all. And his record couldn't carry it cheaply. The thing about never facing consequences is that you also never develop the muscles to handle them. So when they finally arrive, all at once, they hit a person with no idea how to absorb them, which is exactly the position he'd kept me in. Except I'd developed the muscles and he never had. He was 34 years old and facing the first real consequence of his life. And he had no idea how to even begin, because no one had ever made him learn. My license was restored once the responsibility was correctly assigned. My record was cleaned. My name, the thing I'd spent my whole life keeping clean to earn a belonging that was never actually conditional on it, was mine again. And my parents. My parents spent weeks trying to fix it and could not. And I think that impotence was its own kind of education for them. They were used to being able to save Brett. They'd built their whole family around the ability to save Brett, with me as the resource that made the saving possible. And now, the resource had removed itself legally and permanently. And they discovered that without me to absorb things, they actually couldn't make Brett's consequences disappear. They didn't have $6,400 to throw at it themselves. That had always been the unspoken thing, the reason it had to be me. I was not just the willing absorber, but the able one, the one with the good credit and the steady job and the responsible savings. Take me out of the equation, and the family simply didn't have the resources to keep Brett consequence-free. They'd been living off my reliability for so long, they'd forgotten it was the only thing holding the whole arrangement up. Now they were learning it late, and it was breaking something in the family's whole machinery. I want to tell you about the conversation with my mother a few weeks later, because it's the one that closed the door. She came to me, and she didn't apologize, not really. She did the thing my family always did, which was to reframe their failure as my coldness. "I just don't understand how you could be so calculated," she said. "Building a folder for months, going to a notary, behind your own family's back. Where is your heart, Sylvia? After everything we did for you, after everything we did for me, the unplanned child, the one they'd had to figure out." And I realized, standing there, that she genuinely believed it. That in her mind, taking me in as the surprise baby had created a debt. And the debt was payable in exactly this currency: my endless absorption of Brett's costs. I was supposed to spend my life grateful enough to be useful because I'd been allowed to exist at all. And I said the thing I'd needed to say for 30 years. "Mom, you've spent my whole life telling me I was the accident and Brett was the plan. You taught me my place was something I had to earn by being useful, so I learned it. I became the most useful person in this family. And the day I stopped being useful to Brett, you found out exactly how much my place was ever really worth to you. That's not me being cold. That's just me finally believing what you always told me about where I stood." She didn't have an answer for that. There isn't one. She left, and we have barely spoken since. And the silence between us is the most honest thing that has ever existed in our relationship. I didn't disown my family in some dramatic scene. It was quieter than that, and sadder and healthier. I just stopped. I stopped being the one who absorbs. I stopped saying yes to the things that were really just requests to make myself smaller so Brett could stay comfortable. I drew a line, a clear, unmistakable line around my name, my money, my record, my life. And I informed my family, without drama, that the line was permanent. I would not be paying Brett's debts. I would not be lending my name to anything ever again. I would be a person in this family on equal terms, or I would be a person at a careful distance, and which one it was would be up to them, not up to how useful I agreed to be. Drawing that line was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I want to be honest about that. Because I don't want anyone to think it felt clean or easy or triumphant. It felt like grief. It felt like cutting off my own arm because being the useful one had been my whole identity, my whole strategy for being loved, my whole answer to the question of why I deserved to exist in a family that hadn't planned for me. Letting that go meant facing the terrifying possibility that without my usefulness, there might be nothing left that my family wanted. And the awful, freeing truth I discovered is that they didn't particularly, that once I stopped absorbing, they mostly stopped reaching for me, which hurt. But it also answered finally and completely the question I'd been asking my whole life. I'd always wondered whether I was loved or just needed. Now I knew. And knowing, even though it was the sadder answer, was lighter than the not knowing had ever been. Brett and I are not in contact. He never apologized. People like Brett don't, because apology requires believing the other person was wronged. And Brett still, to this day, believes the wrong was mine, that I betrayed him by refusing to keep absorbing his life. I've made my peace with that. You cannot wait for an apology from someone who experiences your boundary as your crime. My parents and I exist at the careful distance. They chose, in the end, to keep defending Brett, to keep seeing me as the one who'd been cold rather than the one who'd been used. And so the distance became the relationship. It's not the family I wanted, but it's an honest one finally. And honest and distant turned out to be so much lighter than close and erased. People ask me, the few who know, whether I feel guilty for the folder, for filing it, for not just paying the $6,400 and keeping the peace like my mother wanted. And I think about the version of me who would have paid it, the one who'd spent 30 years buying belonging with usefulness. She'd have written that check and eaten the suspension and felt, for a little while, the warm relief of having kept her place by absorbing the cost one more time. And then it would have happened again, because it always happened again. The folder wasn't really about $6,400. It was about the arrangement underneath the $6,400. The lifelong agreement that Brett's consequences were mine to carry. That my name was a resource the family could spend. That I was the surface their messes were allowed to land on. Paying it quietly wouldn't have ended that. It would have renewed it. No, I don't feel guilty. My brother said, "You barely drive, so what's your problem?" He meant it as a dismissal, proof that my license, my name, my life didn't really matter enough to make a fuss over. But I barely drive turned out to be the truest, most powerful fact I had. Because I barely drove, I could prove beyond any argument that none of it was ever mine. He handed me my own dismissal and never realized it was the key to everything. My whole life they told me I didn't really count. And it turned out that the proof that I didn't do it, the proof that set me free, was built entirely out of the fact that I was never really there at all. There's a lesson in that I keep turning over. For 30 years, my invisibility in that family had been a wound, being the overlooked one, the unplanned one, the one whose absence no one quite noticed. And then, at the end, that same invisibility became my salvation. The fact that I was never where the car was, never behind the wheel, never the one doing the damage, the very peripheralness that had hurt me my whole life, was the airtight alibi that proved my innocence and broke the family's hold. They'd spent 3 decades treating me as barely there. And being barely there was, in the end, exactly what saved me. I took the thing they'd used to diminish me, and I made it the foundation of my freedom. I built a folder out of being overlooked. And when my brother finally saw what was on top of it, his smile died. And my name, the name they'd treated as common property my whole life, came home to me at last. It was always mine. I just had to stop letting them drive it. These days, when I get in my own car, license restored, record clean, my name meaning only what I choose for it to mean, I think about how long I let other people steer a life that had my name on it. Not just the car, the whole thing. And I think about the quiet, ordinary power of a folder full of the truth, built page by page, by a person everyone assumed wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention the whole time. They just never thought the overlooked one was keeping the records. That was their mistake. It will not be one they get to make again.